Like many past conflicts, the war in Ukraine has been a constant race to develop and deploy new systems, with new weapons and tactics sometimes changing the rules of the fight, and in other cases helping to counter new developments and keep the status quo in place. And so roughly once a year, I've been looking at collections of hyped up systems, many of which were billed as potential game changers, to see how they've ultimately measured up. And so in today's 2025 episode, we'll cover a full range of systems across the complexity spectrum, from the very high-tech, like Russia's Oreshnik missile, to distinctly low-tech anti-drone solutions, like shotguns or sticking an armoured shed over a tank, through to a few items that are genuinely creative, like Ukraine's passive acoustic detection system for Russian one-way attack drones, or a few items that still remain in the uncertain category. And so in today's episode, I'll start with a quick refresher on how we've evaluated these systems in the past, what metrics we use and how that determines where they end up on the tier list, and then we'll work through a number of systems split across three main categories: fires, so missiles and other ordnance, drones and counter-drone systems, and then finally a couple of honourable or dishonourable mentions that won't get a full evaluation, which I thought deserved at least something of an inclusion. Before we get into it though, I'd like to welcome back a long-term sponsor. In a fast-paced news environment, and I think it's fair to say that 2025 qualifies as one, it can be hard to know when you see a story reported that you're getting all the relevant details and angles front and centre. If you look at the recent reporting of Russian drones being shot down in Polish airspace, for example, this article flags that drones were shot down. This one flags that Allied Dutch fighter jets were involved in those shoot-downs, while this one elevates details both about quantity, between 11 and 20 drones making their way into Polish airspace, and what we've heard from both Moscow and Warsaw about whether or not this was intentional. The tool being used to quickly flip between headlines here is long-term channel sponsor Ground News, which allows you to scan the reporting of more than 10,000 news sources worldwide, while also providing some potentially useful context for that coverage. Think things like ownership information, while also giving you access to a variety of tools to help you shape how you monitor media, whether that's building custom filters focused on the topics that you care about most, or tools like the blind spot feed that are deliberately designed to surface stories that might not receive much coverage in the kind of media you typically consume, which might be handy if you want to better understand not just what you're reading on the internet, but what others are reading as well. I've been a Ground News user for years at this point, and if you'd like to be as well, there will be a link in the description. That'll give you access to a 40% discount on Ground News Vantage plan, which is the one I use. So if you're interested, feel free to check it out. Now, with my thanks to Ground News as always, let's get back to it. Okay, so obviously determining whether or not something counts as a game changer is inherently a subjective exercise, but how have we done it in the past, and how are we going to try and do it today? In the previous episode, I used a 5-point system, and for consistency's sake, it's going to make a return today. Systems are going to be judged based on how well they performed relative to the amount of media hype, how effective they are and what sort of direct impact they've had, how efficient they are, with the key there being cost efficiency and accessibility. Then we look at both trends and alternatives. What could militaries use instead if they didn't use that particular system? And are they becoming more or less relevant on the battlefields of Ukraine over time? And then finally, a but-for test. Basically asking if Russia and Ukraine didn't have and couldn't have these systems, what would change? And if the answer is very little, you might not be looking at a game changer. Because this is the internet, based on those subjective criteria, all the systems we look at are going to be put on this tier list here, with the systems near the top ideally being those that are proven effective, cost-efficient, which are becoming more important, have had a large total impact, have few alternatives, and preferably have outperformed both the resources and media hype involved. Those near the bottom have the characteristics of recent Ferrari F1 seasons. Plenty of hype and potential, but relatively few results relative to the resources poured into them. As always though, I'm going to include at least one massive caveat up front, which is that rating systems individually like this is always going to be dangerous. Because I'd suggest that historically, with a couple of arguable exceptions, massive changes in battlefield dynamics usually result from combinations of systems, not individual ones. Guided rocket artillery systems are dangerous, but only phenomenally so when they're paired with sensors that can find their targets for them. The dynamics of 1914 weren't created by heavy water-cooled machine guns, modern artillery, or barbed wire. They were created by the combination of all of them. And I'd argue the incredibly dangerous, slow-moving battlefields of Ukraine are no different, where drones have combined with modern communication and networking technologies, cannon and rocket artillery systems, barriers like wire and mines, and lethal and long-range air defense systems that have been used to zone out opposing air power and prevent it being fully leveraged to potentially break the deadlock. So do keep in mind today, when we're evaluating individual systems, that ultimately they're just one part in a much bigger battlefield puzzle, and that it's important to understand not just how effectively they perform by themselves, but how they combo with everything else out there. Caveats in place, let's start with a couple of things that go boom. or things that are meant to go boom, since I didn't want to make another episode about Russian oil refineries just yet. So to lead off in the fires category, while we're later going to be talking about some quite complex systems, I want to start with one of the simpler ones. Russian and Ukrainian glide bombs, their evolution, and their impact on the battlefield. As a bit of a refresher, in the opening days of the 2022 invasion, a number of Russian strike aircraft engaged in free-fall bombing attacks. Tactics that, with some nuances, wouldn't look that out of place in Vietnam or World War II. The problem, of course, is that against a functional air defence system, and Ukraine quickly proved that it had one of those kind of tactics are essentially suicidal. The VKS was forced to quickly abandon that approach and sit mostly on the sidelines. Although much to the criticism of some Russian military analysts and commentators, it doesn't appear the approach has entirely died out of the Russian playbook. With Russia's recent West 2025 military exercises, notably including free-fall bombing attacks, including by strategic bombers, from an altitude of only 1 kilometre. Unfortunately for Ukraine, the VKS hasn't been kind enough to serve up any strategic bombers to the Ukrainian air defence system by trying those tactics for real, and instead we eventually saw the VKS pivot to relying on standoff attacks, primarily using glide bombs. As we've covered a bit in the past, the Russians essentially figuring out that maybe JDAM or something like it was a good idea was a terrible development for the Ukrainians. It meant that now Russia could take assets that it already had but weren't particularly useful, strike aircraft like Sukhoi 34 and a stockpile of old Soviet unguided bombs, and with a little bit of relatively inexpensive modification, turn that into a combination to deploy a lot of high explosive against Ukrainian targets. The new glide bomb kits, especially in their original versions, weren't especially accurate, but they were available in large numbers, and they hit hard. When we talked about potential countermeasures to glide bombs, especially back in late 2024, the Ukrainians at that time appeared to have largely settled on two. The first approach was to essentially try and kill the archer, not the arrow. Glide bombs are very inexpensive, and so not worth using expensive anti-air missiles on, but the aircraft that dropped them were a different story. And so we saw a number of cases of essentially sambush tactics, where a powerful Ukrainian air defence system, like Patriot, would be snuck relatively close to the front line, and then when one or more Russian aircraft approached to deploy their glide bombs, the system would be quickly enabled, shots rippled off, the aircraft hopefully brought down, and the SAM moved out of the area as rapidly as possible. That was a high-risk strategy using a valuable and in-demand asset, but by the standards of this war, bold plays using scarce assets have often been a Ukrainian specialty, with the sambush being no exception. That helped push the Russian aircraft back from the front line, reducing the accuracy of the weapons and also the range of targets they could potentially hit. The other approach was to try and make the arrow, if you like, itself less effective through the liberal application of electronic warfare. A lot of sources were quick to claim massive advances in this area, and by March 2025, there are a number of articles saying things like, quote, Russia's glide bombs were unstoppable, but Ukraine has made them useless, end quote. While even one Russian source that I saw at the time complained that Ukrainian electronic warfare was making the bombs less and less reliable. Even when those announcements were being made, however, actual hard data to support those sort of claims of success were relatively thin on the ground. We were still seeing evidence of a lot of bombs being dropped, a lot of visual evidence of what seemed to be relatively accurate impacts, and if there was a period of massive Ukrainian EW success against these systems, then it may have been short-lived. Because as we look at glide bombs today as a potential entry on the game changer chart, the Russians have made at least two notable modifications. The first is just coming up with versions with more range, making a standoff weapon more effective by just adding more standoff. What you're looking at on screen there is a Sukhoi 34 carrying four 500-kilogram UMPKs, so glide bombs, in their PD version, with PD here standing for extended range. Russian sources have been talking about the existence of this system for quite a while, and we got our first visual confirmation in the open source in March of this year. As you can see, even from this relatively grainy picture, it's a much cleaner design than some that we've seen from Russia in the past, and reportedly it extends the range of the bombs when deployed with altitude and speed on their side from between 60 and 80 kilometres to closer to 100 kilometres. While that might still mean that on paper these bombs are outranged by some of the more powerful air defence systems out there, like PAC-2 Patriots, S-400 or Chinese equivalents, it both A, reduces the threat that other air defence systems might pose, and B, in practice, might provide enough protection for the launching aircraft, given it's going to be pretty difficult to park a Patriot battery right on the front line. For its part, compared to the earlier stage of the war, Ukraine also got a range boost in its glide bombs, with the old JDAMs being augmented both by wing systems like JDAM-ER and rocket-boosted systems like the French Hammer, potentially allowing Ukrainian aircraft to launch their lobbing pitch-up attacks from a little bit further back from the flot. There is a constant theme in this war, whether you're talking about drones, missiles, or cannon artillery systems, that having the longest stick gives you an advantage. And in that almost inventory-wide search for greater reach, the glide bombs have been no exception. The other big target area for improvement has been accuracy and electronic warfare resistance. In the beginning, a lot of the Russian conversion kits were very, very basic, and some of them still are. But others have followed the same development track we've seen in things like Russia's one-way attack drones, where you now have systems that include navigation systems that are much more difficult to fool. Things like the Cometa M controlled reception pattern antennas, where you have multiple antennas in a single array, have made an appearance in glide bomb guidance systems, which does suggest these bomb kits might be getting more expensive, but less vulnerable to soft kill solutions. A lot is sometimes made of the fact that under a lot of conditions, these Russian glide bombs might be less accurate than Western equivalents like Hammer or JDAM. But for what it's worth, based on things like impact mapping and videos released by the Russians, I'd suggest the accuracy levels the Russians have been achieving recently are certainly good enough to be painful for the Ukrainians. As we'll see in a moment, a lot of these bombs get dropped, meaning any decent accuracy level is probably going to be enough to eventually score you good hits on even point targets. Essentially, greater accuracy might allow Ukrainian glide bombers to sometime achieve the same effect on target with fewer aircraft and fewer bombs, but, in part thanks to the old Soviet Union, Russia has got a lot of these bombs. What you can see on screen here is a chart showing how many glide bombs the Ukrainians claim the Russians dropped for selected months in 2025. There are a couple of gaps. I don't have the data for January or May, but I think this is enough to get the point across. In 2025, there has been no month where the Ukrainians claim the Russians dropped fewer than 3,000 of these things, roughly 100 per day. In April, that number was north of 5,000, getting close to the likes of 170 per day. And if you look at maps like this one, which is trying to map suspected glide bomb impacts just around one section of the front, then I'd argue those thousands of accumulated impacts are broadly consistent with those Ukrainian claims, and that a system that was first mentioned being used in small numbers by the Russians back in early 2023 is now a major part of their approach to fires on the Ukrainian battlefield. And when I say a major part, there's a little bit of math here that might bring the point home. Consider Russia's cannon artillery systems. If we assume the default shell is a 152mm round carrying about 6 kilograms of high explosive, remembering that most of the mass in an artillery shell is metal so it can survive being shot out of a barrel at high speed, then for every 10,000 shells a day the Russian artillery fires, they're delivering about 22 kilotons of high explosive over the course of a year. So very roughly equivalent to a single 1945-era atomic bomb, although spread over millions of detonations rather than one big one. On an individual basis, Russia's Shahed-style one-way attack drones carry a much larger charge. The reported payload for some recent versions is around 90 kilograms, and we'll generously assume that's all high explosive. And so at a production rate of around 32,000 per year, not counting all of the decoys and other drone types, that's about 3 kilotons of high explosive. But going by the Ukrainian figures, there are both far more glide bombs than Shaheds. About 45,000 will be dropped by the Russians this year if the numbers hold. And even the smallest of those bombs, the Fab 500s, pack a lot of explosive filler. At the low end, you're talking about more than 200 kilograms of high explosive per bomb, and at the other end of the spectrum, the Fab 3000s might carry as much as 1.5 tons of high explosive. Leaving aside those Shoigu specials, however, the average Russian glide bomb is somewhere between a Fab 500 and a Fab 1500. So 200 to 750 kilograms of high explosive per bomb. At 45,000 bombs per year, that gives you somewhere between 9 kilotons at the low end if every bomb is a Fab 500, and 34 kilotons at the high end if every bomb was on average a Fab 1500, suggesting that in terms of raw HE delivered, the glide bombs are significantly outpacing the long-range one-way attack drones, while being potentially equivalent to millions of artillery rounds. Obviously, there are nuances here. The Shaheds can reach targets much further behind the front line, and depending on what kind of target you're trying to service, more small explosions or a single larger explosion might be the more efficient option. Trying to break up an infantry attack in the open, a bunch of small detonations or a cluster munition might be ideal. Trying to level a well-fortified position, and World War I experience might suggest that any arbitrary number of small shells might not do the job that a single large explosive might. But whatever the case, I'd argue the broad point that comes through the math very clearly is that from a Russian perspective, the glide bombs matter. They also clearly matter in Ukrainian service, but exact numbers are harder to get. Supplies of the French Hammer bomb are believed to run to about 1,200 per annum, so between 3 and 4 per day. As for all the other relevant systems, JDAM, JDAM-ER, and domestic Ukrainian systems, because Ukraine is now domestically producing its own glide bomb kits to convert Fab 500s in a similar way to the Russians, for those systems, none of the estimates available were robust enough for me to be comfortable releasing them on YouTube. But I think overall, a fair assessment would be that Ukraine, on average, has access to the more accurate glide bombs, but that they are available in much smaller numbers than their Russian equivalents. So if we turn to our Game Changer scoring index, how do the glide bombs fare? Perhaps unsurprising, given they're the lead-off in this section, the answer is generally pretty well. For both sides, the bombs score relatively highly for effectiveness, with it being particularly notable they're useful for servicing targets that don't have good alternative options. That leads to very high points on two other measures, efficiency and the but-for test. Glide bombs are highly efficient for both sides, both because the kits themselves are cheap, but also because they allow them to get much better use out of resources they already have. If not for glide bombs, it's not clear what Russia's Sukhoi 34s or a lot of Ukrainians' attack jets would be doing a lot of the time. There aren't enough cruise missiles to go around, and conventional unguided munitions are suicidal to use in most cases. The but-for test is also, I'd argue, fairly stark, especially on the Russian side. Without access to literally tens of thousands of glide bombs, it's not clear what Russia would be using to effectively demolish and grind back Ukrainian defensive positions. If all of the glide bomb kits and fab inventories were Thanos snapped out of existence tomorrow, I'd argue Russia's offensive options in particular would significantly decrease. And if a system's existence or non-existence has a meaningful impact on the way battlefield realities develop, then maybe there are worse labels to apply to it than Game Changer. As a result, as of early October 2025, I'm going to put them here on our Game Changer tier list, sitting in the A tier essentially that's previously included systems like Lancet and HIMARS. But from a category of systems that's delivered potentially kilotons of high explosives in Ukraine, let's pivot to one that, despite the hype, has delivered zero. This is Russia's much-hyped Oreshnik ballistic missile. This is an intermediate-range ballistic missile believed to potentially be derived from the RS-26 Rubezh, and in November 2024, to much international fanfare, we saw it used against a target in Ukraine. As best we can tell, that missile was equipped with neither a nuclear nor conventional high-explosive payload. Instead, it appears to have carried multiple dummy warheads, which impacted at the Ukrainian Pivdenmash facility in Dnipro. Because we're still talking about some serious hunks of material travelling at hypersonic velocity, even those inert payloads hit the ground with a lot of destructive energy behind them. Although obviously without the blast effects you might expect if hundreds of kilograms of high explosive had been involved. At the time, Russian figures, including Vladimir Putin himself, indicated the missile was going to be used again. We were essentially told that missiles had been produced and stockpiled, that they'd be further tested, and used under combat conditions. And after that demonstration and Putin's statements, Oreshnik rapidly found a role in the Russian military, a centerpiece for public threats. About a week after saying that Oreshnik would be used again, Putin followed up with the specific threat that it could be used to attack decision-making centres in the Ukrainian capital. In that case, as a potential response to Ukraine firing missiles into Russian territory. Ukraine would go on to fire a number of NATO-type missiles into claim Russian territory, but the Oreshniks never arrived. And reportedly, the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, would later admit to the US chairman of the Joint Chiefs that at least the original Oreshnik strike had nothing to do with Ukraine firing Western missiles across the Russian border, and that the missile strike had been planned before the Biden administration gave Kyiv permission to do so. Other Russian figures, though, would extend the implied or explicit Oreshnik threat beyond Ukrainian borders. The commander of Russia's strategic missile forces would explicitly note that Oreshnik could reach all of Europe, and that observation was published in Russian media. Oreshnik would come up in Russian talking points again and again, but while we've seen plenty of Oreshnik-linked threats when it comes to Ukraine, one thing we haven't seen is any actual Oreshniks, at least ones that have been fired against Ukrainian targets. And frankly, given how many quite capable ballistic missile designs have been produced by the Soviet Union or Russian Federation, I don't think there's any reason to suspect that Russia wouldn't be entirely capable of producing a conventionally armed IRBM of this kind. What I think does deserve questioning is whether they've actually diverted the resources necessary to make it work, produce it at scale, and if they have, how efficient have they managed to make it as a conventional weapon? Because while ballistic missiles can have some fantastic strengths, they can be made to go a very long way, be difficult to intercept, and over certain distances are just about the fastest way you can potentially deliver a payload to a target. Especially if you want an accurate ballistic missile, these are fairly exquisite and expensive ways to deliver high explosive. To give you Cold War era baselines for just how wide the gap can be, if you compare a US medium-range ballistic missile, the Pershing II, to the Tomahawk of the day, the two systems had broadly similar ranges, broadly similar payload capacities, and yet a single Pershing II cost more than $4 million in early 1980s dollars. Adjust that for inflation, and you might be talking north of $12 million US dollars today. My point here is we don't know exactly how expensive or hard to manufacture the Oreshnik is, but on the assumption that the rules of physics operate the same way in Russia as they do in the rest of the world, It's unlikely to be either cheap or simple compared to a lot of the other potential delivery systems out there. If we assess Oreshnik just in the context of the war in Ukraine then, it struggles against a lot of our criteria. The hype level was very, very high, but the effect we've actually seen, at least on the battlefield, is very limited. It's been used to hit exactly one target. Its cost efficiency was likely poor. The answer to the but-for test, what would have happened if Russia didn't have Oreshnik available, is militarily not much. And I'd argue the system struggles pretty severely when you start looking at the available alternatives question. Because while yes, Ukraine might really struggle to intercept something like Oreshnik, they also struggle a lot to intercept some of Russia's other cheaper missile systems. Russia's Iskander TBMs, for example, are significantly cheaper, more widely available, have large conventional warheads integrated, and can really only be intercepted by a handful of high-spec air defense systems in Ukrainian service, specifically things like Patriot. And while yes, Oreshnik has more range than something like Iskander, realistically, for Russia attacking targets in Ukraine, they don't really need it. The core point is that despite all the hype around it, at least in the context of Ukraine, Oreshnik has so far proven to be much more of a political weapon than an actual one. It's expensive, it's complex, it's delivered relatively few results, and there are plenty of functional alternatives available. And so for massively underperforming its hype so far, I'm happy to slot it into D tier, alongside the likes of other much hyped but low-volume Russian programs like the BMPT Terminator. A brief side note here is that what remains to be seen is whether some of Ukraine's domestic missile programs will ultimately be able to avoid a similar fate. As well as the long Neptune missile that we have seen repeatedly used, we've also seen the Ukrainians show off and report to demonstrate at least two other longer-range ground-to-ground missiles, the Flamingo GLCM and a TBM. On paper, both of these systems have a lot of potential. TBMs are difficult to intercept, and Flamingo claims to combine a very long range and a hefty warhead. But as we've seen with many Russian programs, often just designing a system isn't enough. When it comes to production and implementation, a lot can go right, but at the same time, a lot can go wrong. The Russians might attack and destroy production sites or stockpiles. Funding might be insufficient, administration might be bungled, or in some cases, companies might exaggerate their achievements and not be able to follow through on their promises. The core point here is there's a difference between systems having the potential to be game changers and actually becoming them, with one of the big dividing lines often being effective employment at scale. So if you want to understand why, despite the media coverage, Flamingo doesn't make it onto the list today, it's because it remains too early in my view to know exactly which way this story is going to go. Despite the claimed production capacity, we've only seen a handful of missiles used so far, and so their place in the war, and lists like this one, will probably come down to whether or not we see that change in the final months of this year, and how they end up performing if and when the Flamingos start flying. So as I was putting this episode together, one of the categories we were going to have to cover was pretty clear from the start. Amongst everything else, the war in Ukraine is a drone war. As far back as early 2022, and through the years that followed, I pointed out time and time again that drones were one of the major factors in changing how war was fought in Ukraine. And the reality, I'd argue, is that far from drones fading away as people found ways to counter them over time, I'd argue the drones have just become more dominant with every month that passes. Drone performance improved, their payloads became more dangerous, their operators more expert, the tactics of their use evolved, and the relevant production figures added progressively more zeros. To the point where, while in 2022 drones were a significant enabling element on the battlefield, in 2025 they're one of the most definitive elements. Back in February, Russia assessed that Ukrainian drones now account for about 2/3 of Russian losses. But if you factor in their contributions to the use of other systems, providing reconnaissance for the infantry, spotting for the artillery and the air force, resupply for forward elements, and all the tasks the Ukrainians leverage UAS to do, I'd argue it goes well beyond even just that. And at the core of the military challenge here is the fact that drones are just very effective, very accessible, and hard to counter. As we've discussed in previous Game Changer episodes, one of the few elements holding the drones at least somewhat in check, especially earlier in the war, was electronic warfare. With Russia in particular being a world leader when it came to electronic warfare equipment, the Ukrainians being no slouches, and particularly civilian off-the-shelf drones not tending to fare particularly well, when the EM spectrum started to bear a passing resemblance to the Eye of Terror. But while EW is still a very important element of CUAS tactics in Ukraine, it's a countermeasure that drone operators have been trying to adapt to. One of the big innovations here has also been arguably one of the war's simplest. Drones that reject the magic of wireless communication for the simple expedient of just running a very long fibre optic cable, while opposing EW teams struggle with the reality of trying to jam a bloody wire. When fibre optic drones were first introduced to the Ukrainian battlefield, primarily by the Russians, they were usually available in comparatively small numbers and as very basic modifications. Their range tended to be limited, adding the cable meant more weight and worse aerodynamics, and the tactics for using their jam-proof properties to the maximum extent weren't there yet. But in the time since then, we've seen how rapid technical evolution and adoption can be. Ukrainian firms advertise the availability of systems that now have 10 to 20 kilometre long cables, giving you an FPV that's admittedly likely to be quite heavy compared to a radio-controlled one, but which gives you the range necessary to reach well beyond the forward trench lines, while giving exactly zero shits about any EW bubbles you encounter along your way. I also think it's fair to suspect that as far as this threat goes, the problem might get worse before it gets worse. Designs are improving, production rates are increasing, and there's a lot of experimentation still to play out. The Russians, for example, have reportedly trialled fibre optic mothership arrangements essentially, where you have a larger fibre optic controlled mothership drone which carries smaller FPVs closer to their targets, and then launches those smaller FPVs to attack targets connected to the mothership by more fibre optic cables. That potentially extends the range of your drone team in two ways. You have the larger long-endurance drone functioning as a kind of carrier, giving you more physical range, and then also functioning as a signal repeater, giving you more signal range. And even if you don't have a huge amount of faith in these complex mothership arrangements, there's always the good old-fashioned brute force solution, like these things here. Yes, those are 50-kilometre spools of fibre optic cable. Because after all, this is a war between Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of Slavic ingenuity to go around, and you could argue Ukraine has already found a way to extend the range of some of their jam-resistant drones to hundreds of kilometres. Taking their USVs, their drone boats, that can already mount things like satellite internet terminals for communication, and then using those as mini-aircraft carriers essentially to launch FPVs against Russian ground targets. The images you can see on the right there are taken from a system that was damaged and then later captured by the Russians, showing the rough arrangement involved. A very basic launch canister that would accommodate a rack of FPVs and the spools of fibre optic cable. The core point here is these things are not big, they're not expensive, but because of their jam resistance, they can be used to target particularly valuable equipment. We've seen them used extensively by the Ukrainians against air defence systems, for example, but also against jammers, meaning that to oversimplify the relevant drone tactics slightly, it's possible to use jam-resistant systems like fibre optics to go forward first, try to use those to knock out relevant equipment like jammers, sensors and air defence systems, and after you've essentially carried out a Shedcraft CAD-DAD campaign and set the relevant conditions, the cheaper, lighter and more available radio-controlled drones can go forward to cause maximum damage. It's not that fibre optic drones are inherently better for all tasks, or that FPVs should all be swapped over to this new control scheme. It's the fact that fibre optic drones being in the mix makes all of the other drones potentially more dangerous. And as the stats unambiguously show, they were pretty bloody dangerous to start with. Hopefully then, the game changer rating here will be both simple and uncontroversial. In Ukraine, small drones, including fibre optic drones, have been monstrously effective and efficient. And that efficiency doesn't just go to monetary costs, it also goes to casualty ratios. These things are extremely difficult to verify, but I think it's pretty telling that one of Ukraine's more famous drone units, the 414th, Magyar's Birds, claimed to have inflicted 3,719 KIA over the months of August and September for the loss of two of their own, a ratio of approximately 1,860 to 1. War is about as far from a video game as you can get. But if this was a game, I imagine drones would have been either nerfed into the ground or locked behind a paywall years ago. Small UAS are absolutely central to explaining why the fighting in Ukraine looks the way it does. So, a clear S tier, but if you follow this channel, you probably already knew that even before these latest improvements. So instead of spending more time rating the drones, let's have a closer look at some of the ways both armies are trying to fight back against them. Here, for example, you're about to see an incredibly advanced counter-drone system deployed in a Ukrainian context, with the soldier in question waiting for the fibre optic FPV to fly by before advancing and cutting the cable. But assuming this kind of mad lad manoeuvre won't always work, you need to start talking about different countermeasures. Near the top of any list, for example, I'd argue, if you're talking about larger one-way attack or reconnaissance drones, is the threat posed by interceptors. These recently got their own episode on the channel, so I won't reprise the basics of what they are or what they do here, but it's worth noting that even just over the last couple of months, there have been some relevant developments here. For one, even though the ramp-up is still a work in progress, there's already a lot more of them. From an industrial perspective, it's just incredibly difficult to churn out enough traditional manned pads or air defense missiles to match the kind of scale-up you can manage with one-way attack drones like Shahed. But with interceptors, the industrial difficulty and cost of that problem is reversed. In most cases, these things are going to be substantially easier to make than the things they're being used to shoot down. And while they certainly haven't displaced existing systems, they're clearly augmenting them. With Zelensky claiming, for example, that during one recent Russian attack, about 20% of all the incoming Russian UAVs were brought down by interceptor drones. Not an overwhelming percentage by any means, but still pretty significant for systems that are still arguably in their early adoption phase. We're also seeing design improvements and with it, performance changes. The video on the right there claims to show a Ukrainian FPV in testing reaching a speed of 423 kilometers an hour. That's about 260 miles per hour in freedom units and significantly faster than the kind of drones these things are going to be trying to catch. And while that might be very bad news for the Shaheds, Gerbers and Lancets these things might be going up against on a daily basis, it's probably also not great news for anything on the other side that flies that doesn't fly high enough or fast enough to be out of reach. There was another recent helicopter downing, for example, a Russian Mi-8 brought down by a Ukrainian FPV. You can consider the image on the right there a YouTube-friendly before shot, if you will. And I'd suggest it isn't just helicopters that have been in the interceptor drone sites. They may actually have had an impact on some of the systems that have previously appeared on our game changer tier list. In previous years, for example, relatively cheap, simple Russian reconnaissance drones like the Orlan series were near the top of our list. That was because they possessed, at the time, a winning combination of traits. They were big enough and complex enough to fly well behind Ukrainian lines, loiter for significant periods, and identify very valuable targets for engagement, like air bases, multiple rocket launchers, command centres, etc., but at the same time were simple enough and cheap enough to not be worth shooting down with Ukraine's available air defence systems. Interceptor drones shatter that value proposition by giving the Ukrainians an air defence system that has enough performance to bring down the Orlans, the Supercams, etc., while also being cheap enough and available enough to issue widely and do it economically. It's the nature of these kind of exercises that the list can't really be static. And if we were to run the exercise again, those families of Russian reconnaissance drones would probably attract a different rating. And I think we should expect both the numbers and capability of these systems to continue to take off, both in Ukraine and around the world, because there's a lot of imperative out there and no one has any incentive to shove this genie back in the bottle. It's reported, for example, that the UK and Ukraine will be cooperating on interceptor drone production, with know-how and designs changing hands, and Britain mass-producing a new interceptor under the project name Octopus in the United Kingdom. The Pentagon has reportedly recently awarded a $5 billion contract for a more complex type of interceptor, the Coyote, and after the recent spate of drone sightings and disruptions across a number of European cities, including in Denmark, there's a general push to get more Ukrainian know-how and technology into European hands as rapidly as possible, as we saw with the recent Wings of Defence exercise between Denmark and Ukraine. Even as Ukraine itself is still very much in the process of building up its interceptor drone force, the Europeans are reportedly looking at building a drone wall, with Ukrainian-style interceptors potentially being one of the technologies involved. And so from the point of view of our game changer rating system, this is going to be the second of three top-tier entries to make it onto the list. For the moment, interceptor drones have proven to be effective, efficient, with the trends generally moving in their favour, not against them, few alternatives being available, performance, at least so far, generally keeping up with the hype, and the but-for test being particularly punishing here. It would presumably mean a battlefield where Russian long-range reconnaissance drones like the Orlans were able to continue flying with relative impunity, designating targets as they went, and one where the economics of ramping up Shahed attacks were clearly in Russia's favour. Similarly for the Russians, who are finding a lot of their infrastructure, including things like oil refineries, under a lot of pressure from Ukrainian drones, might have been facing some broadly similar dilemmas if this technology hadn't come along. And so to that end, I'm happy to put them in the S tier, with one notable asterisk. Because when you're talking about an air defence system, the interceptor itself, whether that be a missile, a drone, or a cannon round, is only part of the equation. A lot of hype tends to focus on those kinetic elements, but without sensors to support them, they're generally going to be fairly useless. Patriot missiles have impressive performance specs, but without the supporting radar, they're not going to have any idea of where to go. And I'd argue that for Ukraine, given the systems it's been using to defend itself against Russian drone attacks, for example, early warning and good sensors are even more important. A lot of Ukrainian air defence, for example, is still done by mobile fire teams. In a lot of cases, that's basically going to be blokes in pickup trucks, armed with everything from man-pads and laser-guided rockets on the high end, to Soviet-era AA guns or World War I-era machine guns on the low end. Those teams are going to be mobile, but considerably less mobile than the drones they're hunting, which means that in order to be effective, they have to be arrayed ahead of the path the drones are likely to travel. To make that happen consistently, you need an effective early warning sensor network. Which brings us to the next item on this list, Ukraine's network acoustic sensor systems. The beginnings of these Ukrainian systems arguably go all the way back to 2022. There was a program called Zvook, or Sound in Ukrainian, which basically began as a kind of grassroots project between a lieutenant in the Territorial Defence Forces, the CEO of an engineering company, and the CTO of a voice cloning startup. The basic problem to address was that Ukraine only had so many active sensor systems, so air defence radars, and that because those were fairly high profile, Russia would generally treat them as high priority targets, and quite a few were lost in the early stages of the war. The need then was for something that was relatively cheap, could be rolled out on a wide scale, and was also preferably a passive sensor. The approach the Ukrainians came up with was to basically take some audio sensors, microphones essentially, stick them into high points like cell towers, network them all together, and then listen for incoming drones and missiles. Cut forward to 2025, and the largest Ukrainian acoustic sensor system now is called Sky Fortress. The acoustic sensor units reportedly cost between $400 and $1,000 each, are networked together, and have been trained on the acoustic signatures of various Russian systems, including Shahed drones. The fact the sensors are so cheap, are passive, and based around a lot of commercial off-the-shelf technology has a couple of implications. Firstly, Ukraine has been able to afford and access enough of them to actually cover a lot of territory, so you don't have gaps the Russians can work their drones through. On the other hand, small passive sensors are going to be much harder for the Russians to locate than large radar arrays, and even if they can find them, hitting them with a long-range precision weapon, be that an Iskander, a cruise missile, or even something like a Lancet loitering munition, is going to be a losing economic proposition. Because if the sensor goes down, the Ukrainians can just grab another one from the warehouse, drive out to a location, find a new spot for it, and regenerate the network. By working together, all of these little microphones can listen for the telltale sign of the aggressive Russian lawnmowers flying in towards their position, process that information, fuse it with inputs from other sensors like radars, and then transmit that information to the air defence units, including the mobile fire teams, who might be using something as simple as a tablet. I'd be happy to give just my own evaluation of the system, but on this topic, I'm happy to defer to someone who might know a thing or two about air defence. 4-star US Air Force General James Hecker, who's the head of US Air Forces in Europe. Writing on Sky Fortress in 2024, he said the following, quote, "Sky Fortress was the brainchild of a handful of Ukrainian scientists who mounted elevated microphones all around the country and connected them with cellular and radio networks. Using advanced computing to process the results, Sky Fortress quickly identifies and locates incoming attacks and triangulates their likely destinations and flight paths. This information is relayed to mobile firing groups equipped with truck-mounted machine guns and man-portable air defence systems. The MFGs then manoeuvre to the expected engagement point and use optical, thermal and radar-guided tracking systems to complete the engagement. Ultimately, low-cost engagements of low-cost systems bring the fight back to the right side of the cost curve." He goes on to stress the importance of a high-low mix when it comes to air defence assets, saying that, quote, "Such a high-low mix ensures we have top capabilities to execute our most challenging missions, while still affording the overall mass, both force structure and equipment, to cover all geographical responsibilities, plus provide enough depth to sustain ongoing operations and remain resilient to losses." Ukraine is leading the way with Sky Fortress. With its truck-mounted anti-aircraft artillery systems, its MFGs accomplish most engagements with bullets for pennies on the dollar compared to the cost of the drone, not to mention the value of the defended asset, end quote. And what I would add there, if you're talking about these scenarios in 2025 rather than 2024, is that while the kinetic element of that equation might change, the mobile teams might be launching interceptor drones rather than using machine guns and cannons, for example, the need for the sensor data is still going to be there. Interceptor drones don't have particularly long ranges, they're limited endurance systems, and so for the best effect, you're going to want to launch them from the right spot against known targets. And Ukraine's passive sensors are reportedly a key part of how they've managed to do that. The reliability of these systems in identifying their Russian targets has also reportedly improved significantly over time. A piece in the US Air Defense Artillery Journal suggested that originally, these systems could only correctly identify a hostile target about 50% of the time. But with successive iterations, the false positive rate is now relatively close to zero. A Ukrainian source from mid-2024 claimed the number around 1.6%. And reportedly, when the Russians modified their Shaheds to change their distinctive sound profile, presumably from angry lawnmower to pissed off lawnmower, speaking of those Russian modifications, the article said, quote, "Because machine learning algorithms are based on pattern recognition rather than relying on an exact match, the modifications only resulted in a 3% degradation in the system's accuracy. Once the new acoustic profile was detected a few times, the developers were able to retrain the model and restore the system to its previous performance." End quote. The core doctrinal point here, whether you're talking about the Ukrainians or short-range air defence systems in NATO service, is that positioning and forewarning matters. It's possible that some NATO militaries might have enough radars and other active sensor systems to provide enough coverage without needing to rely on these Ukrainian-style solutions. But in Ukraine, the task is just too big for them to effectively handle without them. And even if there were enough radars available, taking some of the weight and transferring it to these kind of affordable, attritable systems means that all else being equal, you're going to have more radars available for other duties. Basically, even if you have enough stuff, that's not a compelling reason not to try and be efficient. And by US assessments, this Ukrainian system is nothing if not efficient. If we take General Hacker's figures of about 10,000 sensors, I suspect it's a little higher than that by now, but let's go with 10,000, and also an estimated price point of around $500 per, then you have a total sensor cost to basically cover the entirety of Ukraine of about $5 million. Even if you dial up the price and number of sensors to the point it costs $10 million, you're still talking about a world in which an entire layer of your air defense sensor system might cost as much as a handful of Patriot missiles. And in terms of the enabling role it plays and the value for money it provides, I'd argue in that respect, it's no contest. The system is reportedly effective, extremely cost-efficient, lacks viable alternatives, has trended to being more capable and more important over time, especially as the Russian Shahed threat has dialed up, hasn't received a huge amount of hype, I'd argue, relative to its performance, and if we apply the but-for test, things get very painful for Ukraine very quickly. I think that merits a pretty clear inclusion near the top of the list, and I think it's notable that the Ukrainians have both demonstrated passive detection systems to NATO at Ramstein Air Force Base, and that a number of European defence firms are working on their own systems. Because it's probably not that other countries lack the technical ability to design and build systems like this, it's they lack the factors that pushed Ukraine to do so. The impetus and urgency of an active war, not just creating an air defence problem, but also pushing a lot of technical talent into the defence space. But not all attempted solutions we've seen to the drone problem have been super innovative, and in any case, early warning sensors like this might not help you much if instead of defending a city deep in Ukrainian territory, you're instead a soldier on the front line or nearby trying to survive the ever-present FPV threat. For that, concealment might work, but imperfectly, especially if your opponent has access to thermal sensors. Jammers can be helpful, but they can be bulky, energy-intensive, only cover certain frequencies, and obviously don't help at all once the fibre optic FPVs come around. And so in some cases, we've seen troops fall back on some relatively basic hard-kill solutions. At their most extreme, that's meant things like thrown rocks or sticks, much of the time just troops trying their luck essentially with their standard-issue assault rifles. But we've also seen the re-emergence of one of humanity's longest-standing handheld anti-air solutions, the shotgun. In the earlier stages of the invasion, so I'm talking especially 2022, 2023, to an extent early 2024, most of the visual evidence I've seen of shotguns being used appears to be very much on an ad hoc basis. The image of a Russian soldier on the right there is relatively representative of what I mean here, where somehow a soldier has managed to get a hold of a very much non-military issued, civilian-type double-barrel shotgun, potentially offering not just one but two last chances against an incoming FPV. The image on the right here is reportedly of a Belarusian volunteer fighting on the Ukrainian side that, from memory, was first posted in late 2023. In this case, it appears to be a semi-automatic being used to defend a trench position, presumably against airborne threats like drones. Well, this is a more recent 2024 example of a shotgun being used alongside an assault rifle, with the AK presumably still being there to cover off a variety of potential tasks, and the shotgun available more as a dedicated CUAS option. And while a lot of the ad hoc usage we've seen has looked like this, individual troops equipped with shotguns as an anti-drone system, we've also seen sources like Russian state media show off a number of vehicle-mounted solutions. This Russian vehicle, for example, is equipped with two top-of-the-line short-range air defense solutions. A bunch of AKs strapped to a metal frame in the back, so one guy can fire them all with a single pull of the trigger, and at the front, what looks like basically a shotgun pepperbox arrangement, where someone stuck a bunch of shotgun barrels together, put them on a mount, to produce a kind of we have metal storm at home, short-range, one-shot anti-drone defense system. Is this the kind of solution you'd probably want to be issuing if you're a major military power equipping your troops to go into a drone-infested battlefield? Probably not, but I think the fact that stuff like this was tried, and that Russian media felt comfortable covering it, potentially suggests at least a degree of official support for these kind of modifications. In 2025, though, I'd argue that at least some units on both sides have moved from shotguns as an ad hoc weapon to one that's deliberately issued and trained on. This interview, for example, released by Ukrainian sources, speaks about every platoon that goes forward having at least one person with a shotgun. And remember, in a Ukrainian context, most platoons are going to be much smaller and well under strength compared to what they would be in most NATO militaries. So in a lot of cases, one shotgun per platoon is not going to be a small-scale issue. They also say that every drone unit is equipped with at least one shotgun to help defend themselves against one of their greatest adversaries, other drone operators. That practice arguably has even fewer trade-offs associated with it than giving shotguns to frontline infantry, because while for the infantry, weight is always going to be at an absolute premium, and they're probably going to want to carry as much ammunition as possible for their primary weapon system in case they encounter Russian infantry, for example, in most cases, the drone teams are going to be at least somewhat further back, and they're probably going to be comparatively more concerned by the threat of enemy drones than they are enemy infantry. We've also seen attempts, especially on the Russian side, to give shotgun-like capabilities to the infantry without either replacing the assault rifle or forcing infantry to carry a second long gun. This is an adapter made by a Russian company, for example, which can convert an underbarrel grenade launcher into a single-shot 12-gauge shotgun. Now, personally, I am deeply doubtful of the ability of a soldier to accurately engage an FPV drone using a single-shot underbarrel launcher, but the obvious advantage here is that it does represent an anti-drone option with much less of a weight trade-off than carrying a full-size shotgun. It's worth noting that per a lot of the video and anecdotal evidence we have about shotguns being used against FPVs, this isn't easy. Now, yes, we do have videos of troops literally riding a shotgun, popping FPVs to defend their vehicle and their fellow troops. But when you're looking at those videos, you need to remember the nature of survivorship bias. If someone is filming and one of their mates brings down an FPV drone that is racing towards their position, they're now alive and in possession of a very cool video of their mate doing something cool. Meanwhile, if their mate flubs their attempt at battlefield skeet shooting, there might not be anyone around to post the video, other than potentially the drone operator, who, if they're using an FPV, might only be in possession of low-resolution footage anyway. FPVs are small, they're fast, and they're hard to hit. At longer ranges, they might not be brought down by particular loads. Birdshot in particular was designed for birds, not things made out of metal and plastic. And at shorter ranges, there's obviously the risk that you set off the explosive the drone in question might be carrying, which might result in casualties anyway. That's part of the reason why we've seen so much experimentation with different shotgun loads that can deliver the best outcomes at various distances, including some admittedly quite creative ones. What you're looking at here, for example, is shotgun ammunition produced by a Russian manufacturer that deploys a small net, supposedly reaching its full extension about 30 metres from the muzzle, and aiming to tangle up a drone's propellers rather than blast it and potentially its warhead apart. The point is that while this might be a ready, infantry mobile, hard-kill anti-drone solution, it's very much imperfect and a last-ditch defensive option. For troops, it's never going to be an anti-drone shield so much as a 6-up armour save when you've got nothing else. But given how pressing the drone threat is, and how few solutions a lot of forces have, especially to fibre optic and jam-resistant drones, in a lot of cases, the logic is going to go that the shotgun offering something is going to be better than nothing. When I was at DSEI, one NATO officer I spoke to said that the only organic anti-drone assets that their dismounts had were shotguns. Having heard that, I followed up by putting the same question to a number of other officers I knew, and the answer was generally the same. For a lot of lower echelon formations in particular, in many cases, the only organic, dedicated anti-drone asset they're going to have is going to be the shotgun. And there is absolutely an active debate over what the ideal anti-drone loading for a shotgun is, and we've even seen companies start to come out with dedicated shotgun modifications meant specifically for the CUAS role. This is Beretta actively marketing their shotguns like other firms have for anti-drone roles. And this is their so-called M4 AI Drone Guardian shotgun. And before you start throwing around that AI craze investor money, AI in this case doesn't stand for artificial intelligence. There is no machine spirit here, it stands for advanced impact, with some of the key imperatives highlighted in the marketing materials, being the ability to hit targets at longer distances with more penetrating power. Obviously with the drone, you want your time to target to be as short as possible, so you hit it as far away as possible, and with enough penetrating power to actually knock it down. Because FPV drones can easily combine the numbers of a seagull with the shot resistance of an emu, and the blast radius of a hand grenade or worse. But notably, even the sales material here describe this as a quote-unquote last resort weapon. Ideally, I imagine everyone, including the Russians and Ukrainians, would love to give their troops access to something better. But for a lot of armies in the here and now, the drones are already here, and shotguns are what they got. And it's primarily because of that lack of alternatives that, at least for the moment, I'm going to slot the shotguns into B tier, along with a couple of other systems we've ranked in the past that could possibly do with a re-ranking in the future. Shotguns are not enormously effective, but they're not completely ineffective, and while they might not be fantastic, until better options come along, I think they deserve a place on the chart, and are probably worth the very limited resources involved in rolling them out. Which brings us to one last form of anti-drone adaptation that appeared in 2024 and I think deserves a bit of a second look in 2025. The Russian and to an extent Ukrainian armoured vehicles that took the concept of an anti-drone cage to its natural extreme. Call them turtle tanks, assault sheds, or armoured vehicles upgraded with a spaced passive CUAS defence system. At their most basic, these vehicles are what happen when you put a giant box on top of an armoured vehicle in order to try and keep the drones out. We saw a couple of Russian units experiment with these things back in 2024, and then for a period there was a stage of frenzied development and deployment, where it seemed like suddenly every Russian workshop had a new idea on how to build a new turtle tank. We were seeing a new design every couple of days, and what was originally a fairly localised phenomenon became one that was present at multiple points along the front, spearheaded by different Russian units. If I was to chart a very basic evolutionary path for the vehicles at that time, it started with just putting an armoured box over a tank. Then the box evolved with better materials and more space protection. There were attempts to improve visibility by adding external cameras to the vehicles, and extra protection against drones by bolting a bunch of electronic warfare systems to them. The tank you can see on screen there is arguably a bit of an exemplar of the point the Russians rapidly got to. A sheet metal or similar shed, spaced cage protection, cameras, electronic warfare systems, and in many cases also a mine roller, with the idea seemingly being that in many cases the assault shed would be part of a wider vehicle assault with a couple of roles, including being a protected engineering vehicle to clear mines, potentially an armoured transport for infantry, and to an extent a defensive sponge against FPVs, protected by both an electronic warfare bubble and its natural capacity to take punishment. After a lot of hype in that window during 2024 though, news reports about these things started to really fall off. And the impression you might get from that gap in coverage is that after initially trying these vehicles, the Russians quickly figured out that they essentially didn't work. They stopped building more of them, and another wonder weapon was consigned to the annals of history. But here's one of the problems with news reports or anecdotes in general. They have a tendency to focus on what's interesting and novel rather than necessarily what's common. Russia losing regular tanks by that point probably wasn't newsworthy. They'd already lost thousands of the things. But turtle tanks were new, they were different, they looked kind of funny, and so a lot of sources were interested in following their adventures, essentially. But while the reporting might have dropped away, potentially partly as a result of the novelty around these things wearing off, the lost data tells a different story, and one that frankly surprised me when I started digging into it. The War Spotting Visually Confirmed Lost database has a specific tag for Russian turtle tanks. And if we chart the percentage of lost Russian tanks that had that tag in the database by quarter, this is the chart we get. What it shows is that as a percentage of losses, turtle tanks were actually much more common in 2025 than they were in the latter parts of 2024. They made up about 12% of Russian visually confirmed tank losses in the fourth quarter of 2024, but between 22 and 25% across quarters 1 through 3, 2025. One of the key contributing factors here appears to be that even as overall Russian tank losses have dropped off as fewer heavy armoured vehicles are used close to the front line, the number of lost assault sheds has remained relatively constant, 28 in quarter 4 2024 as compared to 29 in quarter 2 2025. So while they might not have become more common in absolute terms, as a proportion of Russian armoured vehicles being used close to the front, they've actually gotten more important. The designs of these Mad Max-style assault vehicles have also gotten even more extreme. A lot of Russian shed-equipped vehicles now appear to dispense with the main gun, either because it's been removed or the chassis never had one fitted in the first place. Gaps in the protection, for example a hole the gun might stick out of, are kept to an absolute minimum, in part because no matter how good the electronic warfare protection system is, it's not going to prevent a fibre optic FPV and a good operator navigating through that gap and potentially disabling the vehicle. You'll also see plenty of attempts to generate even more standoff distance and complicate the work of fibre optic drones by adding a significant array of metal spikes to the vehicle to give it even more of a heavy metal post-apocalypse look. This is what you might consider an example of a more sedate design by 2025 standards, although the all-round protection factor is still very clearly quite high. And here I'll include a picture of a Humvee that looks like it would struggle to get road safe accreditation on a lot of European or North American roads, although it's probably pretty well prepared for a Western suburb school pickup, to demonstrate two key points that shouldn't be forgotten. This isn't just an approach being used by armoured vehicles, and also it's not just the Russians. Drones are a survivability problem for everyone. Everyone wants any chance they can get at survival, and in some cases, in the absence of better options, netting and spikes might be it. That said, the drawbacks of these kind of things are relatively obvious, and we haven't seen other nations rush to copy this sort of implementation. In a world where armoured vehicle designers are generally pushing to provide crews with ever more situational awareness, visibility in particular in a lot of these vehicles appears to leave something to be desired, giving the crew the true World War I tanker experience. And I've seen a few videos of these vehicles being knocked out, not necessarily by drone attack, but by the crews doing things like driving them into a ditch or an obstacle that they probably didn't see. You're also adding a lot of weight to the vehicle, a lot of profile to the vehicle, and taking away its offensive firepower. So if you're thinking about that traditional armoured vehicle trade-off of protection, firepower, and mobility, these modifications go all in on making the tank as tanky as possible, providing plenty of anti-drone protection, and also complicating targeting, because if you can't properly see the silhouette of the vehicle, it can be harder to place a shot or know where to shoot. A big challenge for the future of these vehicles, though, might be that there are potentially other protection options available that don't have quite so heavy trade-offs. They're just not available to the Russians and Ukrainians right now. Better active protection systems that can successfully engage drones, remote weapon stations configured for CUAS duty, the better integrated electronic warfare, better protection schemes, and supporting short-range air defence vehicles that can counter the drone swarms. But for the moment, the Russians and Ukrainians generally don't have those things. They do have sheet metal, spikes, and a bunch of blokes with welding torches. And so at least in the short term, we should probably expect the Fury Road conversions to continue. But if we need to put the turtle tanks and assault sheds on our game changer tier list, how do we rate these things? In terms of effectiveness, I'd argue these things are somewhat effective but imperfect and highly polarising. There are plenty of reports, for example, of Russian turtle tanks absorbing a lot of FPV hits. I think the highest number I've heard claimed was 60, which is significantly more than you'd expect a normal tank to take, although the drones in question still probably cost significantly less than the vehicle in the end. The two main problems from an effectiveness standpoint appear to be A, the issue with preventing the opponent getting a mobility kill, even if they can't thoroughly destroy the vehicle, and B, the fact that anti-drone effectiveness often comes at the cost of everything else effectiveness. The real problems I'd suggest, though, are in the hype, but-for test, and alternatives and trends category. When they first started to appear, these things were hyped a lot, and I generally suggest that what they've been able to achieve and the pace of adoption just didn't match that initial hype. The trend has also been, I'd argue, for these vehicles to become more, not less vulnerable over time. A key element of their survivability early on was the idea that you could mount an electronic warfare system to a vehicle, protect it with a giant armoured box, and then use that to potentially counter the drone threat. With the emergence of fibre optic and jam-resistant FPVs, though, that's no longer the protection it once was. Which leads to the final issue of alternatives. Russia's dominant strategy in 2025 hasn't been to try and take their old armoured vehicle tactics, protect them against drones, and then leverage those. It's been to essentially switch from armour-centric tactics to light infantry and, for lack of a better term, light dragoon-centric ones. Small units of dismounted infantry relying on stealth, or units of motorbikers relying on speed, supported by a whole bunch of fires, rather than relying on armour protection and larger vehicles. So ultimately, I'm going to put them down here, ahead of the likes of Oreshnik, but behind other adaptations like the use of anti-drone shotguns, systems that have some use and value and that we're likely to continue seeing, but which underperform their hype and are vulnerable to competing alternatives. Now, in the interest of time, we're getting close to the end of the episode, but given I'm not exactly sure when I'll get around to doing another one of these, I wanted to close out by flagging there's a lot of systems and technologies out there that we could have covered that didn't ultimately make the cut. Old-fashioned concertina wire, for example, has made a bit of a return over the course of 2025, becoming more relevant not just because it's cheap and accessible, but because it can be a useful barrier against dismounted infantry assaults in particular, which have become increasingly common, and be used in combination with other potentially more lethal barriers like the ever-present landmine. Partly to avoid putting combat engineers at risk, we've increasingly seen wire and landmines laid by drones, including the next honourable mention on this list, your logistics UGVs. These are being used for a range of tasks, from frontline resupply to medical evacuation to combat engineering duties. And while they're still significantly less prevalent than UAS, they are an increasingly common feature on the Ukrainian battlefield. I also considered doing a bit of a spot on the combat usage of motorbikes, especially by the Russians, but ultimately decided to bump that to a future episode. The core point here is that while hype might determine whether or not a system is likely to make it into these episodes or not, just because something gets covered doesn't mean it's effective, and just because something isn't covered, that doesn't mean it plays no significant role in the fighting. This is ultimately quite a casual, subjective exercise covering just a sample of the equipment being used. But I do think it serves to demonstrate a couple of overall significant points. That hype and performance are not always correlated. That while any individual system is probably unlikely by itself to win a war, it might have a significant impact, especially combined with other systems, on the way that war is fought and the way it plays out. And finally, that these things are a constant adaptive race. It's possible for previously dominant systems to drop off, for new technologies to arise, but that process isn't guaranteed and doesn't work on any set timescale. So far, I'd argue in Ukraine, for example, small drones have evolved faster than the defences intended to counter them. That can make predicting the next potential game changer a very difficult analytical exercise, and one where, in the end, as we watch a technological race towards a potential Ukrainian battlefield of 2026, only time and ingenuity will tell. And okay, brief channel update to close out. One reason why I wanted to continue the Game Changer series this week, as well as it just being due for another episode, is that it provided a feeling of continuity. The first one dates back to 2023, the sequel 2024, and given this week the channel crossed 600,000 subscribers for the first time, I thought an episode with a little bit of a connection to the past, and a time where those kind of subscriber numbers would have been unthinkable, was ultimately the right way to go. Suffice to say that when I first started doing Defence Economic Centric's PowerPoint on YouTube, to say I wasn't expecting it to grow to this kind of level is an S-tier understatement. And the fact that it has, and that I'm able to continue doing this even years later, ultimately comes back to a single driving factor, that you're all here. And so this week I'll hold back on any other updates and just close out with some thanks. Thank you to all of you for your ongoing support, your comments, your engagement with the channel, because it's at the absolute centre of all of this and why I'm able to do what I do. I genuinely hope that you enjoyed and got something out of this episode, and with any luck, as always, I hope to see you all again next week.